The sting in her palm was nothing compared to the roaring silence that swallowed the great hall of Cretan. A single drop of crimson bloomed on Alpha King Harold's lower lip, stark against his pale, regal skin where Carol's knuckles had connected with the force of a decade's worth of suppressed rage. The glass she had dashed to the floor lay in 1,000 glittering diamonds around their feet, reflecting the horrified faces of the high court. Harold didn't move. He didn't roar. He simply stood there, his sharp silhouette cutting through the golden light of the chandeliers, the dangerous fire in his eyes igniting with a dark, predatory hunger that promised he would never let her go after this. Carol didn't wait for the guards to recover. She turned her back on the throne, the first person in the history of the Cretan bloodline to do so, and walked away, her heels clicking a rhythmic defiance against the marble while the scent of spilled vintage wine and obsession trailed in her wake. Weeks earlier the air had been different, though no less heavy. The high council chamber was a tomb of cold stone and flickering candlelight, smelling of ancient parchment and the iron scent of Harold's presence. Carol Mays stood at the periphery, her hand resting habitually on the hilt of her blade, her posture as rigid as the pillars supporting the vaulted ceiling. She didn't need to look at the head of the long oak table to know Harold was there. Her body recognized him with a visceral magnetic pull that she loathed. It was a physical weight, a shift in the room's oxygen that occurred the moment he crossed the threshold. Harold was deep in a map of the Northern Territories, his sharp modern regal silhouette casting a long shadow over the advisors. He looked every bit the Alpha King, cold, calculated and entirely untouchable. His dark hair was swept back with a precision that matched his governing style, and his voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble that commanded the very molecules of the room to settle. The rogue activity along the border is no longer a nuisance. It is a direct challenge, Harold said, his eyes never straying toward Carol. He treated her with a freezing indifference that was, in itself, a form of violence. I want a shadow guard assigned to my person. Someone who knows the terrain of the old training grounds. Someone who isn't afraid of the dark. Carol's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew that description. It was a trap. Long ago, before the crown had settled on his brow and the iron law had become his gospel, they had been equals. They had bled together on those very training grounds, two spirits forged in the dust and heat of ambition. Back then, Harold hadn't been a king to her. He had been the boy who matched her strike for strike, the only person who could look into her fierce violet-gray eyes without flinching. But when his father died and the weight of an empire fell upon him, Harold had built walls made of glass and steel. He had pushed her into the ranks of the common guard, surrounding himself with a rotating cast of court beauties, vacuous women who preened for his attention while he watched Carol from the corner of his eye, his gaze burning with a possessiveness he refused to name. I have already selected the candidate, Harold continued, finally lifting his head. His eyes, dark and bottomless as a winter night, locked onto hers for the first time in months. The impact was like a physical blow. Guard Mays. Step forward. The council members shifted, murmurs rising like dry leaves in a wind. Carol felt the eyes of the room on her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the king. She didn't bow. She never bowed. She simply walked to the edge of the light, her jaw set in a line of flint. Your Majesty, she said, her voice a cool blade of sound. My duties are with the perimeter watch. My resignation is already drafted for the end of the season. I intend to seek commission in the free cities. A muscle jumped in Harold's jaw. The cold indifference he practiced so well fractured for a split second, revealing a glimpse of the obsessive beast beneath. He stood slowly, his tall frame looming over the table, the gold embroidery on his tunic catching the light like dragon scales. Resignation denied, he murmured, the words intended only for her. Effective immediately, you are bound to my shadow by royal decree. You swore an oath to the crown, Carol. It is time you remembered that the crown belongs to me. I swore to the kingdom, Harold, she hissed back, the use of his name a scandalous breach of protocol that made the advisors gasp. Not to be your trophy guard. Harold leaned across the table, his scent, cedar and cold rain, enveloping her until she could taste it. You will be whatever I command you to be. Pack your things. You move into the royal wing at sunset. Carol stared back at him, her violet eyes burning with a promise of war. He thought he was tethering her to his side, but he was only inviting a storm into his sanctuary. She had sworn she would never bow, and as she watched the king's knuckles whiten against the edge of the table, she realized that his obsession wouldn't just be her prison. It would be the very thing she used to break his reign. Chapter 1. The heavy oak doors of the high council chamber groaned as they swung shut, sealing out the whispers of the palace but locking in a tension so thick it felt like breathing silt. Alpha King Harold Cretan did not look up from the sprawling map of the Northern Territories, but the air in the room shifted the moment Carol Mays crossed the threshold. It was a familiar alchemy. The temperature seemed to drop and the oxygen grew thin, replaced by the sharp metallic scent of his authority and the faint lingering aroma of cedarwood. Carol stood at the foot of the long table, her spine a column of unyielding steel. She wore the charcoal gray uniform of the border guard, a rank she had fought for with blood and sweat, primarily because it kept her leagues away from the throne and the man who sat upon it. Her hand rested habitually on the pommel of her blade, her fingers grazing the leather wrap. She did not bow. She had stopped bowing the day Harold was crowned, a silent protest against the wall of ice he had built between their shared childhood and his lonely absolute reign. "You summoned me, Your Majesty," she said, her voice a cool, level blade that sliced through the heavy silence. Harold finally lifted his head. His eyes were the color of a winter sea before a storm, dark, turbulent, and depthless. In the flickering light of the chandeliers, his features were all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a face carved for the coin of a conqueror rather than the warmth of a friend. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze tracing the defiant set of her jaw and the way her violet-gray eyes refused to flicker. It was a look of clinical assessment masking a raw, possessive hunger that had been simmering for years behind his mask of kingly indifference. "The reports from the perimeter suggest a lapse in discipline, Guard Mays," Harold said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in the pit of her stomach. He walked slowly around the table, his movements possessing the fluid, dangerous grace of a predator. "You seem to have forgotten that your primary duty is not to the dirt of the borders, but to the stability of this crown." "My discipline is unmatched and the borders are secure," Carol countered, her voice tightening. "If you wish to discuss logistics, I have my logs. If this is about my request for transfer to the free cities at the end of the season, the paperwork is already on your desk." Harold stopped just inches from her. The proximity was a violation, an intentional use of his height and heat to remind her of the power dynamic she constantly tried to ignore. "The free cities," he mused, the words tasting like ash. "You truly believe I would let my most capable asset vanish into the wind because she has grown bored of her post? I am not an asset, Harold. I am a soldier." "You are mine," he corrected, the possessive pronouns hitting her with more force than a physical blow. The mask of the distant king slipped for a heartbeat, revealing the obsessed man beneath, the one who spent his nights staring at the stars she slept under, surrounding himself with court beauties just to see if the sight of them would finally make Carol flinch. He never did. "And as your king, I have decided that your talents are wasted on the fringes. The Shadow Pack is moving in the dark and I find myself in need of a guard who knows how to fight as I do. One who isn't blinded by the glitter of the court." He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her shoulder before he pulled it back, clenching it into a fist at his side. "I am issuing an iron decree. As of this moment, your commission with the border guard is terminated. You are hereby assigned as my personal shadow guard. You will eat where I eat, walk where I walk, and stand watch at my door while I sleep." Carol felt the walls of the room closing in. The decree wasn't a promotion, it was a cage. He was pulling her from the wild freedom of the frontier and dragging her into the suffocating intimacy of his private life. It was a sentence of proximity, a way to force her to look at him, to breathe his air, and to eventually, he hoped, break beneath the weight of his presence. "I won't do it," she hissed, the words a scandalous treason. "I am a warrior, not a lapdog. I will not spend my days watching you flirt with duchesses and my nights standing like a statue outside your bedchamber." "You will do exactly as you are told," Harold whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear. The heat of his breath made the fine hairs on her neck stand up. "You swore an oath to this crown when we were children, Carol. You swore to protect the heart of this kingdom. Did you think that oath had an expiration date? Did you think I would let you walk away and become a ghost in some distant city while I am still here burning? You're suffocating me," she spat, turning her head to glare at him. Their faces were so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises, the only warmth left in a man who had turned himself to stone. Then learn to breathe in the dark, Harold replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken thread. Pack your things from the barracks. You move into the royal wing at sunset. If you attempt to leave the city, I will treat it as desertion. I will hunt you down myself, and I promise you, the cage I build for you then will not have a view of the gardens. He stepped back, the cold mask of the Alpha King clicking back into place as if the raw confrontation had never happened. He returned to his maps, dismissing her with a flick of his wrist. Carol stood there, her heart hammering a frantic, trapped rhythm against her ribs. She had spent years building a life that didn't include him, a life where she could forget the way he looked when he laughed or the way his hand felt against hers. With a single decree he had shattered it all. She turned to leave, her boots echoing like a death knell on the stone floor. She didn't bow as she reached the doors. He didn't have to. Harold was already watching her back, his eyes fixed on her with a terrifying, absolute focus. He had turned her duty into a prison, but as Carol stepped out into the hallway, her jaw set in a line of flint, she made a silent vow of her own. He might own her time and he might own her service, but he would never own the one thing he craved most. He would never bow. And if he wanted her in his shadow, he would have to learn to live with the fire she was about to bring into his world. Chapter 2. The moon hung like a jagged shard of bone over the training grounds of the Cretan stronghold, casting long, distorted shadows across the packed earth. It was well past midnight, the hour when the rest of the palace was surrendered to sleep or the hushed whispers of the corridors. But for Carol Mays, sleep was a luxury she had discarded the moment her belongings were moved into the royal wing. The weight of the Alpha King's obsession had become a physical presence, a phantom hand around her throat that she could only loosen by the rhythmic, punishing exertion of steel against steel. She moved through the forms with a fluid, desperate aggression, her practice blade whistling through the air. Each strike was a silent rebellion against the Iron Decree, a way to reclaim the agency Harold had stripped from her with a few strokes of a quill. Her charcoal tunic was damp with sweat, clinging to the lithe, powerful muscles of her back, and her breath came in sharp silver plumes in the freezing night air. She was so focused on the internal fire burning in her chest that she didn't hear the approach of the man who occupied every corner of her mind. Your footwork is sloppy, Guard Mays. You're leading with your anger, not your edge. The voice was like a low vibration in the earth, vibrating through the soles of her boots before it reached her ears. Carol didn't stop. She pivoted, her blade cutting a gleaming arc toward the voice, only to be met with the deafening clang of steel as Harold parried her strike with effortless precision. He was dressed not as a king but as a predator. Gone were the heavy robes and the gold-threaded tunics. He wore a simple black training shirt that strained against the broad expanse of his shoulders, his dark hair damp and clinging to his forehead. In the moonlight, his eyes were predatory, two wells of dark obsidian that missed nothing. He didn't look like a man who had come for a peaceful practice. He looked like a man who had come to burn everything to the ground just to see what remained in the ashes. I didn't hear you enter the circle, Your Majesty, Carol spat, her lungs burning as she reset her stance. I assumed you were occupied with the Duchess of Thorn. I believe she was quite eager for your attention at dinner. Harold's lip curled into a shadow of a smirk, a dark, dangerous thing. He circled her, his movements a perfect mirror of her own, the two of them caught in an orbit they had perfected a decade ago. The Duchess is a pleasant distraction, but she lacks the fire I require in my personal guard. She bows too easily. It makes for a very dull evening. Then perhaps you should find a woman who isn't under your thumb by royal decree, Carol countered, lunging forward. The clash of their blades was rhythmic and violent. This wasn't the sanitized sparring of the court. This was a psychological war played out in iron. Harold wasn't just fighting her. He was testing the limits of her endurance, pushing her back with a relentless, overwhelming strength that forced her to use every ounce of her training to stay upright. He wanted to see her break. He wanted to see those violet-gray eyes cloud with the realization that he was the absolute master of her world. You think you're different from the rest of them because you refuse to kneel, Harold murmured, his voice barely audible over the ring of steel. He caught her blade in a lock, stepping into her personal space until the heat of his body was a physical assault. But look at you, Carol. You're here in my circle, in my palace, breathing my air. You've spent your whole life running from me, yet here you are. Closer than you've ever been. I am here because you are a tyrant who cannot stand the thought of a woman he cannot own, she hissed, her face inches from his. She could see the flecks of gold in his irises, the raw, unvarnished obsession that he usually hid behind the cold mask of the crown. You can chain me to your shadow, Harold, but you'll never find what you're looking for in my eyes. There is no submission here. Only the reflection of a man who is afraid of being alone. The comment hit home. The air between them sparked with a sudden lethal intensity. Harold's grip on his sword tightened, his knuckles whitening. With a sudden burst of power, he broke the lock and swept her legs out from under her. Carol hit the dirt hard, the air driven from her lungs in a painful wheeze, but before she could even process the fall, Harold was over her. He didn't offer a hand, he pinned her blade to the earth with his own, his body hovering just inches above hers, trapping her in the dust. You think I want your submission? He whispered, his voice a jagged rasp of desire and rage. I want your fire, Carol. I want the part of you that hates me because at least that is honest. At least that means you're thinking of me every time you close your eyes. Carol looked up at him, her chest heaving, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The midnight air was freezing, but she was burning up, consumed by the proximity of the man who was her greatest enemy and her oldest friend. In that moment the psychological war shifted. He was trying to break her spirit, to make her feel small and conquered, but all he was doing was stoking the embers of her defiance into an inferno. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She stared directly into the darkness of his obsession and let her own fire shine through. Then you've already lost, Harold, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Because the more you try to own me, the more I will burn you. You wanted a shadow that bites. You found one. For a long, agonizing heartbeat, Harold didn't move. The world seemed to shrink down to the space between them. The scent of cedar, the cold moonlight, and the suffocating weight of things unsaid. Then slowly he stood, withdrawing his blade and offering her nothing but a cold, distant stare. The training session is over, he said, his voice once again the ironclad mask of the Alpha King. Get some rest, guard Maze. You have the morning watch. And remember, the fire that burns too bright eventually consumes itself. He turned and walked away into the shadows of the palace, leaving Carol alone in the dirt. She sat up, wiping the dust from her face, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer electric force of the encounter. He had tried to break her, but as she watched his retreating silhouette, she knew he had failed. He hadn't dampened her spirit. He had turned it into a weapon. The earth was scorched, the war was declared, and as Carol stood up and retrieved her blade, she realized that in this game of obsession, the king was the one who was truly losing. Chapter 3. The golden light of the banquet hall was a cruel mockery of the Cold War raging in the palace's private corridors. Under the high vaulted ceilings of the great chamber, the scent of expensive lilies and heavy perfumes masked the underlying tension that always seemed to follow Alpha King Harold Cretan. Carol Maze stood like a statue carved from shadow against the velvet draperies of the east wall, her charcoal gray guard's uniform a stark, somber contrast to the kaleidoscopic silks of the court ladies. Her hand remained resting on the hilt of her blade, her gaze fixed forward with a discipline that was becoming a physical ache. Across the room, Harold was engaged in a performance of calculated cruelty. He sat upon his secondary throne, a glass of dark wine in his hand, while the Duchess of Thorn leaned in close enough for her pearls to brush his shoulder. The king, who normally possessed the warmth of a tomb, was radiating a manufactured charm. He laughed, a low melodic sound that Carol felt in the marrow of her bones, and reached out to trail a finger along the Duchess's jawline. It was a gesture of intimacy he had never once offered Carol in public, a weaponized display of affection designed to act as a hook in her side. Harold's eyes flickered toward Carol for a fraction of a second, checking for the flinch, the narrowing of the eyes, or the tightening of the jaw that would signal his victory. He wanted her jealousy. He wanted her to feel the sting of being replaced by a woman who knew how to kneel, who knew how to giggle at his jests and stroke his ego. But Carol gave him nothing. She remained a ghost in his periphery, her face a mask of stone, though internally she was a tempest of resentment. She knew his games. She knew that every whispered word to the Duchess was actually a shout directed at her, a desperate attempt to force her into admitting she still cared. The air in the room became stifling, the laughter of the court sounding like the sharpening of knives. After an hour of watching Harold's public courtship, Carol felt the need for oxygen more than she felt the need for duty. Taking advantage of a shift in the guard rotation, she slipped through a side exit, the heavy oak doors muffling the king's performance behind her. She found herself in the quiet, moonlit courtyard of the lower barracks, a place where the air smelled of wet stone and horsehair instead of stifling lilies. It was here, away from the throne's suffocating gravity, that she saw him, Julian, a young soldier she had trained with before her life had been turned into a royal cage. He was sitting on a stone bench, sharpening a whetstone against his sword, the rhythmic shik-shik a grounding sound in the silence of the night. "You look like you're ready to execute someone, Carol," Julian said, not looking up, though a small, knowing smile played on his lips. "The night is young," Carol replied, finally letting her shoulders drop as she sat beside him. Julian was everything the king was not. Open, steady, and devoid of the labyrinthine mind games that defined Harold's existence. For Carol, his friendship was a forbidden solace. To the king, any man who drew a smile from Carol was a target, but Julian was the only one brave enough, or foolish enough, to treat her like a human being rather than a piece of royal property. "The king is making quite a scene tonight," Julian remarked, his voice dropping to a cautious level. "The barracks are already whispering about the Duchess. They say he's looking for a new favorite." "He's looking for a reaction," Carol corrected, her voice tight with a bitterness she couldn't quite hide. "He's using that woman as a pawn in a game she doesn't even know she's playing." Julian stopped his sharpening and looked at her, his expression softening. "And are you playing, Carol? Because you've been standing in his shadow for weeks and you look like you're fading away. You used to be the fiercest blade on the border. Now you're just a ghost in a hallway." "I am a prisoner by decree, Julian. I don't have the luxury of being myself." "You always have a choice," he whispered, reaching out to place a hand over hers. It was a simple gesture of comfort, but in the world of Alpha King Harold, it was an act of war. The free cities are still there. If you ever decide you've had enough of his shadow, there are people who will help you find the light. The moment was shattered by a sudden, violent change in the atmosphere. The temperature didn't just drop. It plummeted. The heavy doors leading back to the palace were flung open with such force they rebounded against the stone walls. Harold stood in the doorway, the golden light of the banquet hall behind him casting his silhouette into terrifying relief. He was no longer the charming suitor of the Duchess. He was the Alpha King, a man possessed by a rage so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen. His gaze dropped to where Julian's hand still rested on Carol's, and the air in the courtyard began to crackle with his power. "Julian," Harold said, the name sounding like a death sentence. "I believe you have an early watch at the North Gate. A gate that is currently 4 miles from this bench." Julian stood quickly, his face paling, but he kept his head up as he saluted. "Yes, your Majesty. I was just—" "Go," Harold barked, the command vibrating with a supernatural weight that forced the soldier to move. As Julian hurried away, Carol stood her ground, her heart hammering but her eyes burning with defiance. Harold didn't speak until they were alone, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he closed the distance between them. He stopped so close she could feel the radiating heat of his fury, the scent of the Duchess's perfume still clinging to his clothes. A final lingering insult. "You find comfort in the dirt of the barracks now?" Harold asked, his voice a jagged rasp. "Is that what you prefer? A common soldier's touch over the position I've given you?" "Julian is a friend," Carol snapped. "Something you wouldn't understand. And he doesn't use me to perform for a court full of vultures." Harold grabbed her arm, his grip not painful but absolute, pulling her flush against his chest. "I used no one. I was merely demonstrating what a woman looks like when she understands her place." "Then go back to her," Carol challenged, her face inches from his. "Go back to your Duchess and your games. But don't you dare think you can dictate who I speak to in my moments of peace. You own my service, Harold. You don't own my soul." "I will own every part of you before this is over," Harold whispered, his obsession flaring in his eyes like a dark sun. "You think Julian is your solace? I could have him transferred to the salt mines with a word. I could make sure you never see a face you recognize again." "Then do it," she dared him, her voice trembling with the sheer force of her hatred and the unwanted electric spark his proximity ignited. "Show the kingdom exactly what kind of monster you've become. Break everything. Burn the world. But you'll still be standing there alone and I still won't bow. Harold stared at her, his chest heaving, his control fraying at the edges. For a moment she thought he might kiss her or strike her. The line between the two felt impossibly thin. Instead, he released her with a shove, turning his back on her as he looked up at the moon. "Back to your post, guard Maze," he said, his voice cold and distant once more. "The Duchess is leaving and I require my shadow to escort me to my chambers. Try not to let the scent of the barracks offend the royal carpets." As Carol followed him back into the golden cage of the palace, she realized the war had escalated. Harold's courtship of cruelty had failed to make her weep, but it had succeeded in making him more dangerous. He was no longer just trying to win, he was trying to isolate her until he was the only thing left in her universe. But as she watched the king's rigid back, she thought of Julian's words about the free cities, and her fire grew. Harold was trying to use the world to bait her, but he was forgetting one thing. A woman who has already lost everything has nothing left to fear from a king. Chapter 4. The silence of the royal archives was heavy, tasting of centuries-old dust, vellum and the cold, unyielding weight of history. It was a labyrinth of towering mahogany shelves that seemed to lean inward, whispering the secrets of dead kings into the shadows. Carol Mays moved through the aisles like a wraith, the soft tread of her boots muffled by the thick rugs. She had sought the library not for knowledge, but for the rare hollowed-out peace it usually provided. Here, at the very heart of the palace, the air felt ancient and indifferent to the petty obsessions of the living. She reached for a leather-bound volume on Northern military history, her fingers grazing the spine, when the atmosphere in the room curdled. The temperature didn't just drop, it crystallized. The familiar magnetic pull of Harold's presence rippled through her nerves before she heard the click of the heavy latch. He didn't come with guards or advisors this time. He came alone, his footsteps deliberate, echoing through the stacks with the cadence of a heartbeat. Carol didn't turn around. She pulled the book from the shelf, her knuckles white as she gripped the cover. "I didn't realize the Alpha King had an interest in the tactical failures of the Second Era," she said, her voice a low, brittle chime in the stillness. "Or did you simply follow me here because the palace felt too large without your shadow to haunt?" "I followed you because you're avoiding your duties." Harold's voice emerged from the darkness of the next aisle, closer than she expected. He stepped into the pool of amber light cast by a lone flickering sconce. He had discarded his formal jacket, his white linen shirt unbuttoned at the throat, making him look less like a king and more like the boy she had once sparred with until their hands bled. But the look in his eyes was entirely adult, dark, starving and dangerously focused. "You left the training ring an hour early. You vanished from the strategy table. I don't recall giving you leave to hide among the ghosts." "I'm not hiding," Carol snapped, finally spinning to face him. The book felt like a shield between them, though she knew it was useless against a man who could dismantle her with a word. "I am taking a moment of silence. A luxury you've made sure is nearly extinct in my life. Every hour I spend in your presence is a performance, Harold. I'm tired of the stage." Harold took a step toward her, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floorboards. "A performance? Is that what you call our nights on the training grounds? Is that what you call the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching?" "I look at you and see a man who has traded his soul for a crown," she countered, her voice rising as the resentment she'd been hoarding for weeks began to overflow. "You treat me like a prisoner. You use other women to try and spark a jealousy I refuse to give you. You threaten the few friends I have left. You've turned your obsession into an iron decree, because you're too much of a coward to ask for what you actually want." Harold's face hardened, his jaw setting into that familiar, unyielding line of stone. He closed the distance between them in 2 predatory strides, pinning her back against the mahogany shelf. The scent of him, rain-washed cedar and something uniquely, infuriatingly him, invaded her senses, making her head swim. "You think I don't know what I want?" he hissed, his hands coming up to grip the edge of the shelf on either side of her head, caging her in. "I want the woman who stood on the border and told me she'd rather die than come back to the capital. I want the girl who used to laugh when she beat me at swordplay. But mostly I want the defiance you used to keep me at arm's length." "Then you're a fool," Carol breathed, her chest heaving as she pressed her hands against his chest to keep some semblance of space between them. His heart was drumming a frantic, violent rhythm against her palms. "Defiance isn't love, Harold. It's survival. It's the only thing I have left that you haven't managed to put a leash on. Then keep it. Harold suddenly roared, the sound vibrating through her bones and rattling the glass panes of the library cabinets. The mask he had worn for years, the cold, untouchable alpha, didn't just slip, it shattered. He leaned down, his forehead nearly touching hers, his eyes burning with a desperate, fractured light. Stay defiant. Hate me. Strike me. Refuse to bow until your knees break. Just don't leave. Don't go to the free cities. Don't vanish into the light where I can't find you. Carol froze, the raw vulnerability in his voice more shocking than any physical blow. Why? She whispered. Why does it matter where I am as long as your kingdom is secure? Harold let out a jagged, self-deprecating laugh that sounded more like a groan. He closed his eyes for a second, his breath hitching. When he looked at her again, the king was gone. There was only a man who had reached the end of his tether. Because I cannot breathe without it, he admitted, the words a jagged rasp of truth. Every noblewoman in this court agrees with me. Every advisor bows. Every soldier follows. The world is a chorus of yes, Carol. It's silent and suffocating and empty. You are the only thing that is real. Your anger, your refusal to kneel, the way you look at me with such beautiful, pure hatred, it's the only air I have left. I am obsessed with your defiance because it's the only thing that reminds me I'm still alive. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the frantic beat of two hearts trapped in the dark. Carol looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the hollowed-out exhaustion behind his authority. He was a man drowning in his own power, and she was the only anchor he had left, even if that anchor was made of thorns. For a heartbeat, the anger in her chest wavered, replaced by a terrifying, electric recognition. She didn't want to bow, but she realized with a jolt of fear that she didn't want to leave either. Her independence was her pride, but it was also her loneliness. You're a monster, Harold, she whispered, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. I know, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. But I'm your monster. And as long as you're fighting me, I know you're still mine. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but the admission hung in the air like a bared blade. The library breach had stripped them both naked, leaving only the raw, jagged edges of an obsession that was no longer just his. As Carol stared back at him, her heart of flint sparked, realizing that their war was far from over. It had simply moved into deeper, more dangerous waters. Chapter 5. The night of the Crescent Gala arrived with a shimmering, predatory elegance that draped over the capital like a silken shroud. For centuries, this was the evening where the power of the Cretan bloodline was most visible. A display of opulence, ancient alliances, and the quiet, lethal politics of the court. But for Carol Mays, it was a battlefield that required a different kind of armor. While the other noblewomen spent their afternoon drenched in floral oils and swathed in soft, billowing tulle, Carol had chosen a garment that felt like a declaration of war. As she emerged into the grand gallery, the air seemed to hum with a collective intake of breath. The gown was a masterpiece of slate-gray silk and intricately woven silver scales that clung to her lithe frame like a second skin. It wasn't designed to make her look soft, it was designed to make her look dangerous. The fabric caught the light with every movement, shifting like liquid mercury, mimicking the cold, hard glint of a sharpened blade. Her dark hair was swept back into a high, severe knot, held in place by a silver pin shaped like a dagger, and her violet-gray eyes burned with a fire that no amount of royal decorum could dampen. She didn't look like a guard, and she certainly didn't look like a lady of the court. She looked like the physical embodiment of the king's obsession. The great hall was a cathedral of gold and obsidian, filled with the scent of roasted game, expensive wine, and the underlying musk of 100-year-old stone. When Carol descended the stairs, the orchestra's melody faltered for a fraction of a heartbeat. The whispers of the court, usually a low, constant drone, died away as she cut through the crowd. She wasn't walking, she was prowling. At the far end of the hall, seated upon the high throne, Harold Cretan was a statue of regal isolation. He wore the heavy, dark mantle of the Alpha, his crown a jagged circle of obsidian and silver that seemed to weigh down the very atmosphere around him. He had been performing his duties with a mask of bored, kingly detachment, accepting the bows of foreign dignitaries and the flirtatious glances of the elite with the cold indifference of a mountain. Then he saw her. The shift in the room was instantaneous. It was as if a physical cord had snapped taut between the throne and the entrance. Harold didn't just look at Carol. He stared with a raw, unvarnished intensity that made the surrounding courtiers stumble in their conversations. The wine glass in his hand remained frozen halfway to his lips. For years the kingdom had watched their king look at the crown, look at the maps, and look at the laws. But in that singular, breathtaking moment, the court realized with a jolt of collective terror that the Alpha King was no longer looking at his legacy. He was looking at her. Carol didn't stop until she reached the base of the dais. She stood in the center of the floor, the liquid silver of her dress rippling like a disturbed pool. She didn't offer a curtsy. She didn't lower her gaze. She simply stood her ground, her chin tilted up in a silent challenge that echoed through the vast chamber. Harold stood slowly, his dark robes flowing behind him like a shadow. He ignored the Grand Duke standing beside him, ignored the music, and ignored the thousands of eyes watching for a sign of weakness. He descended the steps of the dais until he was standing directly in front of her, his presence a suffocating magnetic force. "You look," Harold began, his voice a low, jagged rasp that carried further than a shout in the unnatural silence, "as though you've come to execute the entire court, Carol." "I told you once before, Harold," she replied, her voice steady and clear, reaching the ears of every whispering gossip in the room. "I am a warrior. I do not dress for the comfort of kings. I dress for the inevitable end of the dance." Harold's eyes traced the silver scales of her gown, his pupils blown wide until the gold flecks in his irises were nearly swallowed by darkness. The obsession that had been a secret, simmering thing in the library and the training grounds was now laid bare before the world. He reached out, his fingers barely grazing the cold, metallic silk at her waist. "The dance hasn't even begun," he whispered, a dangerous, possessive heat radiating from him. "And I have no intention of letting anyone else lead." In that moment the power dynamic of the kingdom shifted irrevocably. The Crescent Gala was no longer a celebration of the crown. It was the public unveiling of a king's madness. The court watched in stunned realization that the iron law was melting in the face of a woman who refused to bow. As the orchestra began a slow, haunting waltz, Harold didn't return to his throne. He took her hand, his grip absolute, his gaze never wavering, and pulled her into the center of the light, marking her as his obsession for all the world to see. Chapter 6. The music of the Crescent Gala had shifted into something haunting and dissonant, a string quartet playing a melody that felt more like a dirge than a celebration. In the center of the ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and spilled wine, the golden light of the chandeliers reflecting off the silver scales of Carol's gown like moonlight on a freezing sea. Harold's hand remained clamped around hers, his grip a silent testament to the desperation he was still trying to mask with the cold authority of a monarch. The court had retreated to the shadows of the pillars, a ring of predatory faces watching the apex of a decade-long storm. Harold led her toward the center of the dais, his movements stiff, his breathing shallow. He could feel the eyes of the foreign dignitaries and the local high lords boring into his back. To them he was no longer the unbreakable alpha. He was a man mesmerized by a subordinate who had spent the night radiating a lethal independence. He needed to reassert the hierarchy. He needed to prove, mostly to himself, that the Iron Decree was more than a paper shield for his obsession. He stopped at the foot of the throne and turned to face her, releasing her hand with a sudden, sharp motion. The silence in the hall was so absolute that the flickering of the wall torches sounded like thunder. "The night is reaching its zenith, guard Maze," Harold said, his voice carrying that low, deceptive silkiness that usually preceded an execution. "We have honored the traditions of the ancestors and the alliances of the crown. But there is one tradition yet to be observed. A tradition of loyalty." Carol stood her ground, her chin tilted up, the silver pin in her hair catching the light like a bared tooth. "I have served your crown since the day I was old enough to hold a blade, Harold. My loyalty is written in the scars on my arms." "Service is not the same as submission," Harold countered, his voice rising, vibrating with a jagged edge of suppressed panic. He felt her slipping away, the fierce autonomy in her eyes making him feel smaller than the crown he wore. He needed her to break. He needed to see her head bow just once, to know that he hadn't lost his grip on the only world that mattered to him. "You stand before your king in a garment that mocks the uniform you wear. You speak with a tongue that lacks the salt of respect. Tonight, before the eyes of the great houses, You will show the court what it means to be the king's shadow. He stepped up a single stair, looking down at her, his eyes dark with a terrifying, fractured intensity. Kneel, Carol. Offer the formal bow of the shadow guard. Tame that fire for one heartbeat and acknowledge the throne you serve. The request was a trap, a public branding. To kneel now, after the liquid armor of her dress and the library's raw admissions, would be to surrender her soul to his obsession. Carol felt the weight of every gaze in the room. She saw the Duchess of Thorn smirking from the shadows, eager to see the warrior humbled. No, Carol said. The word was small, but in the vastness of the hall, it sounded like a mountain cracking. Harold flinched as if she had struck him. His face went pale, then a deep, dangerous crimson. The desperation he had been fighting all night finally curdled into a cruel, defensive rage. He couldn't admit he was a man begging for his heart to be recognized. He had to be a king punishing a traitor. No. Harold repeated, a mirthless, jagged laugh escaping his lips. He turned to the crowd, his arms spread wide as if inviting them to witness a tragedy. Do you hear her? The woman I plucked from the dirt of the border, the woman I granted the highest honor of the royal wing, treats the command of her alpha like a suggestion. He turned back to her, his gaze narrowing into something sharp and venomous. Perhaps it isn't pride that keeps your knees stiff, Carol. Perhaps it is a different loyalty altogether. I saw you in the courtyard with the soldier, Julian. I saw the way you leaned into his common touch. Tell me, is it treachery that keeps you upright? Are you already pledged to the shadows that seek to undermine this kingdom? Is your independence just a mask for a rebel's heart? The accusation was a lie, a low blow delivered by a man who was drowning and trying to pull his anchor down with him. He was using the very thing that made her human, her friendship with Julian, to brand her a criminal, all because he couldn't handle the fact that he couldn't force her to love him. You know that's a lie, Carol hissed, her voice trembling with the sheer force of her hurt. You are using the crown to hide your own fear, Harold. You're calling me a traitor because you're too much of a coward to admit you're obsessed with a woman who doesn't owe you her knees. Silence! Harold roared, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a physical blow. He descended the step, closing the distance until their chests were almost touching, his breath hot against her skin. You are a guard of Cretan, and you have publicly defied a direct command during the Crescent Gala. You speak of cowards? You are the one hiding behind a blade. If you will not bow as a servant, you will stand as a prisoner. He looked over her shoulder at the high-ranking sentries standing by the doors. Seize her. Guard Maze is to be stripped of her rank and held in the North Tower pending an inquiry into her ties with the dissident factions. If she values her defiance so much, let her see how it tastes against the stones of a cell. As the guards moved forward, their armor clanking in the heavy silence, Carol didn't move. She stared directly into Harold's eyes and saw the truth he was trying to bury under his accusations. He wasn't taming her, he was losing his mind. The fire in her eyes didn't go out. It turned into a white-hot coal of pure, unadulterated loathing. You think this makes you a king? She whispered so low only he could hear. You've already lost, Harold. You've turned the only person who truly knew you into your enemy. Enjoy your throne. It's going to be very cold tonight. The guards reached for her and for a moment, the liquid silver of her dress flared as she tensed to fight. But she didn't strike, not yet. She allowed them to take her arms, her head held higher than it had ever been. As they led her out of the hall, the court parted like the sea, leaving Harold standing alone at the foot of his throne, the golden light of the gala casting him in a shadow that looked exactly like a cage. He had accused her of treachery to hide his own heart, but as the doors groaned shut, the silence that remained told him the truth. He had finally broken the one thing he couldn't live without. Chapter 7. The golden light of the Crescent Gala felt like an executioner's lamp as the guards closed in on Carol. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and the metallic tang of fear, but Carol stood as still as a statue of silver and spite. Harold watched her from the dais, his chest heaving, his eyes searching her face for a crack, a plea, anything that resembled the girl he used to know. Instead he found only the cold, hard reflection of his own cruelty. As the captain of the guard reached for her arm, Carol didn't flinch. With a movement as fluid and sudden as a lightning strike, she snatched a goblet of dark, heavy wine from a passing servant's tray. The liquid was the color of a fresh bruise. In one explosive motion she flung the contents directly into Harold's face. The court let out a collective strangled gasp. The wine dripped from the king's obsidian crown, staining his white linen shirt like a spreading chest wound. He stood frozen, the dark liquid stinging his eyes, a physical manifestation of the shame he had tried to heap upon her. But Carol wasn't finished. Before the guards could react to the sacrilege, she stepped into his space, invading the royal sanctity of the dais. Her hand arched through the air, and the sound of her palm connecting with his cheek echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a thunderclap. The force of the blow snapped Harold's head to the side. A thin trail of crimson bloomed at the corner of his mouth where her knuckles had caught his lip. For a heartbeat the world stopped spinning. The Alpha King of Cretan had been struck, shamed, and rejected in front of every power broker in the realm. "You want a traitor, Harold?" Carol's voice was a low, jagged rasp that carried to the furthest corners of the hall. "Then look in a mirror. You betrayed the boy you were, and you've murdered the king you could have been. I won't bow to a ghost." She didn't wait for the guards to seize her. She didn't wait for the roar of fury she knew was coming. Carol turned her back on the throne and ran. The silver scales of her dress hissed against each other, sounding like 1,000 tiny blades. She tore through the crowd, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the marble. Behind her, she heard Harold's voice finally break the silence, not with a command but with a raw, guttural howl of her name that sounded more like a sob than a threat. She burst through the heavy oak doors, the cool night air hitting her lungs like a tonic. She knew the palace layout better than any architect. She knew the shadows and the blind spots where the torchlight didn't reach. She sprinted toward the west garden, the liquid silver of her gown snagging on rose briars, tearing the expensive silk she had worn as armor. Her heart was a drum in her ears, drowning out the shouting of the sentries and the clanging of the alarm bells. She had to reach the north gate. She had to reach the stables. If she could get to a horse, the free cities were a 3-day hard ride away. She could vanish. She could finally breathe. But as she rounded the final corner toward the outer perimeter, the shadows of the great gate didn't stay still. They detached themselves from the stone walls, shifting with a predatory grace that didn't belong to the royal guard. These men weren't wearing the charcoal gray of Cretan. They were draped in the ragged furs and bone charms of the shadow pack. Carol skidded to a halt, her breath hitching. To her left, a massive man with eyes like yellow glass stepped into the moonlight, a heavy iron net draped over his shoulder. To her right, 3 more emerged, their teeth bared in jagged grins. "The king's weakness," the leader rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "He broke his own walls to keep you close, little bird. He made it so easy to find you." Carol reached for the silver pin in her hair, the dagger she had used as an ornament, but before her fingers could touch it, a heavy weight crashed into her back. The iron net descended, cold and suffocating, dragging her to the gravel. She fought with the ferocity of a trapped wolf, her nails clawing at the dirt, her screams for help dying in her throat as a gloved hand pressed against her mouth. Through the gaps in the iron mesh, she looked back toward the palace. The golden light of the gala was still spilling from the windows, and she could see a lone figure standing on the balcony. Harold, his silhouette sharp and tragic against the sky. He was looking for her, his obsession finally realizing that in trying to cage the wind, he had let the storm in. "Harold," she tried to scream, the irony tasting like copper in her mouth. The man she had just struck was the only one who could save her, and the man who had tried to own her was the reason she was currently being dragged into the dark. As the world faded into the blackness of a heavy sack, the last thing Carol heard wasn't the sound of her captor's laughter, but the distant, frantic tolling of the palace bells, the sound of a king who had realized too late that his obsession had become his undoing. Chapter 8. The silence that followed the tolling of the palace bells was far more terrifying than the clamor that had preceded it. In the great hall, the scent of spilled wine and expensive perfume had curdled into the copper tang of impending slaughter. Alpha King Harold Cretan stood on the balcony, his fingers gripping the stone railing so hard the ancient marble began to spiderweb with cracks. Below, the silver-gray shadows of the forest had swallowed the woman who had just branded his soul with the sting of her palm and the fire of her rejection. He didn't move for a long minute, the wine still dripping from his chin, staining the white linen of his shirt like a fresh wound. To the court watching from the doorway he looked like a man defeated. But the air around him began to hum, a low, subsonic vibration that made the glass chandeliers rattle in their sockets. The iron law he had lived by, the restraint, the calculation, the cold indifference, wasn't just cracking, it was being incinerated by a sun-bright rage. "Your Majesty," the captain of the guard stammered, stepping onto the balcony with a trembling salute. The perimeter was breached. They were too fast. "We believe it was the Shadow Pack. We are organizing a search party to depart at first light." Harold turned. The captain stopped speaking, his breath catching in his throat. The man standing before him was no longer the king who debated trade routes and border treaties. The gold flecks in Harold's eyes had expanded, swallowing the dark irises until his gaze glowed with a feral, predatory light. The obsession he had tried to cage behind decrees and library walls had finally broken its tether, and it was a monster. "First light." Harold's voice was a jagged rasp, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "By first light they will have crossed the Black Creek. By first light, they will have touched what belongs to me." He stepped toward the captain, his movements possessing a fluid, lethal grace that bypassed all human restraint. He didn't issue an order, he unleashed a manifesto of carnage. "I do not want a search party. I want a war. Call the elite riders. Tell them to leave their armor. It will only slow them down. We are not going as soldiers. We are going as hunters." But the treaties with the rogue territories, the advisor began emerging from the shadows. Harold's hand shot out, seizing the man by the throat and lifting him an inch off the ground. There was no hesitation, no kingly patience left. "Burn the treaties," Harold hissed, his face inches from the advisors. "Burn the maps. If a blade of grass stands between me and Carol Mays, I will salt the earth of this entire continent. I am no longer ruling a kingdom. I am reclaiming my life." He dropped the man and strode back into the great hall, his heavy boots echoing like the beat of a war drum. The court parted like a sea before a shark. He reached the throne, but he didn't sit. Instead, he grabbed the obsidian sword of his ancestors from its ceremonial stand, a blade meant for execution, not sparring. As he crossed the threshold of the palace, discarding his royal mantle and leaving it in a heap on the blood-stained wine, Harold Cretan felt the last of his humanity slip away. He didn't care about the scandal of the strike. He didn't care about the public rejection. He cared only for the electric memory of her defiance and the absolute certainty that he would tear the world apart to hear her voice again, even if she used it to curse him. The night air hit him cold and sharp, but he didn't feel it. He swung himself onto his black stallion, the beast sensing the rider's madness and rearing with a panicked whinny. Harold didn't use a crop. He leaned forward, whispering into the horse's ear a promise of blood and exhaustion. "She swore she would never bow," Harold murmured to the dark forest ahead, his teeth bared in a jagged, terrifying smile. "And I will kill every living thing that tries to keep her from standing before me." The riders thundered out of the gates, a streak of black against the moonlight. Harold led the charge, his obsidian blade drawn and gleaming. He wasn't a king anymore. He was the embodiment of a singular, maddened obsession, a force of nature that had traded its crown for a collar and its soul for a scent. The Shadow Pack thought they had taken a trophy to break a king, but they were about to realize they had invited a demon into their woods. Harold didn't want justice. He didn't want peace. He wanted the fire back in his shadow, and he would turn the kingdom into a scorched earth wasteland to find the woman who was the only air he had left to breathe. Chapter 9. The smoke from the final skirmish had long since dissipated into the jagged peaks of the northern range, leaving behind a silence that was no longer heavy with secrets, but clean with the scent of rain and renewal. The rescue had not been a neat royal affair. It had been a descent into the primordial dark, a journey where Alpha King Harold Cretan had shed every pretense of his crown to reclaim the woman who was his anchor. He had found her in the heart of the Shadow Pack's stronghold, not as a broken victim, but as a warrior who had turned the very iron of her cage into a weapon, her violet-gray eyes still burning with the same defiance that had ignited his obsession. Now, as the first rays of a new dawn spilled across the marble balcony of the great hall, the palace of Cretan felt different. The iron law, that cold and suffocating decree of absolute submission, lay in ruins, much like the white linen shirt Harold had discarded on the night of the gala. The court was silent, but it was the silence of anticipation, not of fear. The nobles stood in a wide circle, their eyes fixed on the two figures standing at the center of the dais. Harold stood tall, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. The obsidian crown was absent from his brow. Instead he wore a simple tunic of charcoal wool, the gold embroidery gone, leaving him looking more like the man he had been on the training sands than the king he had been forced to become. Beside him stood Carol Mays. She was no longer dressed in the liquid silver of a trophy or the rigid gray of a subordinate. She wore her own leather armor, scarred and salt-stained from the road, her dark hair flowing free over her shoulders. The moment of truth arrived as the High Chancellor stepped forward, holding the Great Seal of the realm. The protocol of centuries demanded that Carol kneel, that she acknowledge the Alpha as her absolute master before the kingdom could be made whole. The court held its breath, waiting for the familiar power play, the struggle for dominance that had nearly burned the kingdom to ash. Harold looked at Carol. The predatory hunger that had once defined his obsession had matured into something far more dangerous and profound. A mutual respect that bordered on the sacred. He didn't reach for her arm. He didn't issue a command. He simply waited, his eyes searching hers, offering her the one thing he had never given anyone else, a choice. Carol didn't kneel. She didn't bow. She took a step forward, her spine a column of unyielding strength, and met his gaze with a level of equality that made the advisors gasp. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers interlocking with his in a grip that was neither a surrender nor a conquest. It was a pact. "I swore I would never bow to the Alpha King," Carol said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "And I never will. But I will stand beside the man who went into the dark to find me. I will stand with the ruler who realized that a kingdom of knees is a kingdom of ghosts." Harold's hand tightened around hers, a small genuine smile breaking the stone-like mask of his face. It was the first time the court had seen him look truly alive in a decade. "The Iron Law is dead," Harold declared, his voice echoing with a new kind of authority, one that didn't need to shout to be heard. "From this day forward, Cretan will not be ruled by obsession or fear. It will be ruled by the fire that refuses to be put out. There will be no more trophies. Only partners." He turned to Carol, the golden light of the new reign catching the flecks of gold in his eyes. "No regrets?" he asked softly, the words intended only for her ears, echoing the vulnerability of their shared past. "None," Carol answered, her violet eyes softening for the first time. "As long as we're fighting the world together, Harold, and not each other." When he kissed her then, it wasn't a claim of ownership. There was no audience in his mind, no law to uphold, and no kingdom to prove a point to. There was only the heat of her defiance and the warmth of his heart finally finding its peace. The court erupted not in the practiced applause of subjects, but in the genuine roar of a people who had seen their leaders become human. The future they began to build that morning was not one of easy peace, but of honest friction. They still argued in the library. They still sparred until the moon was high on the training grounds. But the walls were gone. Harold no longer needed to mask his feelings behind cruelty, and Carol no longer needed to hide her heart behind a shield of flint. The Alpha King had found his match, and the woman who wouldn't bow had found a man worth standing for. As the sun climbed higher over the capital, the promise of a new era took hold. A reign defined not by who knelt, but by who had the courage to stay upright together until the end of the dance. Thank you for listening to this story. Don't forget to like, comment where you are listening from, and hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have another wonderfully interesting story for you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. God bless.